So hello and welcome, and sorry that we're a little late. This also happens with online events. So we are very happy that there are already a couple of people online and are in us in this event on Zoom and on Facebook. So this is our third and unfortunately for now last event in the series on war economies in North Africa and West Asia. And today's event has the headline Syria's War Economy, War as a Reform. And we will focus on economy in Syria during and after the Syrian uprising/war. My name is Untitled Chapter. I represent Disorient and I'm going to moderate today's event. Disorient is a collective of progressive journalists, academics, and activists working between Germany, West Asia, and North Africa, the so-called Ghana region. We are inspired by post-colonial and feminist thoughts and run an online magazine. And through this online magazine and the many events we organized in Germany and maybe in German, we try to influence public but also academic discourses on the region. We also organize workshops and try to do political education in Germany on the region. And who is interested to know more about our project is welcome to visit our website, www.disorient.de, and the link will be shown soon in the chat rooms on Zoom and Facebook. This event was realized in cooperation with the Bildungswerk of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and with support of the Deutsche Klassenlotterie. This series initially started offline, and we are really happy that we now managed to continue this very important discussion on war economy that is becoming more and more important and more present in the discussion, especially when it comes to Syria, but also when we talk about Sudan, one of the countries we discussed in the very first event. So we are happy that we now can continue this discussion online. So please feel free to engage in the discussion. So write in the chat rooms on Facebook and on Zoom, and we will try to integrate your comments in the discussion. And at the end of the discussion, there will also be more room for you to directly post your questions. Please consider that you cannot give a voice intervention, but that you have to use the chat rooms. This is especially the case for the people that join us via Zoom. So today we will deal with a critical perspective on war economy in Syria. And in this regard, we are very, very happy that we can welcome with us tonight's discussant, Joseph Daher, who is joining us from Geneva. So welcome, Joseph. Joseph is a Swiss Syrian socialist activist, academic, and founder of the blog Syria Freedom Forever. We will also later post his blog in the chat. He's part of the Wartime and Post-Conflict in Syria project at the European University Institute, Florence in Italy. And he's also the author of Hezbollah, the Political Economy of the Party of God, Pluto Press 2016. And also the author of Syria After the Uprisings, the Political Economy of State Resilience, Pluto Press and Haymarket 2019. And this is how the book looks. So I really recommend you to have a look at these books, and especially the letter has a whole chapter on today's topics, so on war economy, construction, and challenges. And we were already lucky to have discussed the book with Joseph some weeks ago, and you can read up a discussion of this book on our website. The article is in German, so in German it's Syrien durch die Linse der politischen Ökonomie. And many thanks to Henriette Böll-Stiftung, one of our colleagues in the Orient for having conducted this interview before the event. We also post the links to the interview in the chats. We'll also have today a video input from Abdallah Al-Khatib. He's a Palestinian Syrian activist that has been active on Syria and on the topic of Palestinian refugees in Syria. He had been active in local Syrian civil society throughout the uprising in Syria and has lived in the military siege of southern Damascus until its very end. And he will share with us some thoughts on how they as civilians encountered the siege in southern Damascus. So we will learn that that the siege is not only a military tool, but actually the regime also really economically benefited from these sieges. So it's important to look at this tool on these different layers. The very idea of the series was to offer a critical understanding of the very prevalent term war economy, and hereby adding to the discussion. The discussion on war economy became, according to our feeling and understanding, really intense for the last few years, apparently triggered by renewed interest in this concept through this seemingly calming conflict in Syria, hereby suggesting that the situation of war and war economy has to be replaced by a peace economy. And actually both terms are really vague and also morally loaded. So peace economy is then often characterized as investor friendly and hereby especially meaning foreign Western investments. And this term not at all implies anything about actual real peace, so meaning social justice, for example. The reconquering of large parts of Syria by the Syrian regime by mid-2018 put an end to oppositional governance in many areas of Syria and caused a huge wave of forced displacement of people to the oppositional held north of Syria. And with this new situation at hand, the question on reconstruction and hence post-war realities was suddenly put on the table. And this is how the whole discussion on war economy and its implication became en vogue again, let's say. So we really thought it's important to do a critical intervention here. Throughout the series, we have looked at Sudan, Kurdistan, Iraq, Central Iraq, and now Syria. And I'm very happy that we could win Joseph for this discussion. Again, I want to encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat rooms. And yeah, I'm happy to have also your interventions and ideas here. So, in the series on war economies, we have discussed the concept of war economy and economy so far from different angles. We started with an analysis of Jamie Allenson from a Marxist point of view, and we will also post one of his articles on this topic in the chat rooms. Jamie is making the point that war economy and economy cannot be looked at separately, as this would suggest that there is something we could call peace economy. He rather encourages us to understand war on the one hand as, quote, a form of economy of the management of resources and to production and reproduction of life to benefit certain classes of people at the expenses of others, and the economy, on the other hand, as a form of war, unquote. Hereby, he suggests to see Syria's pre-war economy condition in a completely different light. So rather than assuming that the distortion of the economy by war is what, for example, explains the outbreak of civil war, he actually urges us to look at the pre-war economic condition as a reason to understand why people start a revolution, why they think they have to rise up and fight against a regime, against a government that continuously dispossesses them, as it was the case in Syria with the crony capitalist economy of the Syrian regime. Furthermore, in our last event on Kurdistan, Iraq, and central Iraq, Sheikh Bassama urged us to understand economy from an anthropological point of view and understanding the economy as a way of making a living. And through this understanding, she also helped us to actually reconceptualize the warlike conditions in Kurdistan throughout the 90s at the time of the sanctions against Iraq. Now, I would be really interested to hear from Joseph. What is your take on the war economy? And again, for the audience, please engage, please post your questions online, and I will try to already pose questions of understanding, but the deeper questions we will put them at the end of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Ansar. Thank you for inviting me. I think also Disorient for organizing this event. I'm really happy to be able to join you from Geneva and to join all of you who are watching, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. So I totally agree on the framework you have put to understand the war economy. Unfortunately, very often when we speak about war economy, it is a complete separation of what used to occur, for example, prior to the war in Syria, but more generally how we understand the dynamics ongoing, for example, in a country like Syria, but we could go in other countries that suffered war as well, where there's no separation at all, but more forms of continuation. And actually the war very often exacerbates prior economic dynamics. And when it comes to the Middle East, it's very clear that looking at Syria, but we could see, for example, the case of Lebanon after the civil war in the 90s, or in Iraq after the 2003 US-British-led foreign intervention, that it exacerbated prior economic dynamics, meaning that you had a deepening of the speculative commercial economic model dominating the region, and especially in forms of investing in short-term profit-seeking sectors such as trade, real estate, service sectors at the expense and at the detriment of the manufacturing sectors, for example, agriculture. And this was very clear. Again, in Syria, these kind of dynamics did not appear with the war. It exacerbated them, but you had this kind of economic dynamic starting slowly in the mid-end of the 80s with the fiscal crisis in Syria, and the re-emergence of a class of traders. And this we'll see is very interesting to see, is that the main, and we'll speak about it later on, that the main new businessmen in Syria are especially in this kind of economic sectors of trade, intermediaries, etc. And actually, you had an acceleration of neoliberal policies in the 2000s with the arrival of Bashar al-Assad to power, which was obviously associated with what we called, and what I call in my book, also crony capitalism, meaning, in other words, that, you know, businessman has built, that had accumulated capital because of the specific relation with the center of power, in other words, the presidential palace. And all these aspects have been exacerbated during the war in Syria, showing that war economy is not a separation. You don't have a separation prior to 2011 and after 2011. And this is very clear on the economic field, meaning, in other words, that agriculture and manufacturing that suffered humongously during the war of destructions. In absolute terms, obviously, the production diminished considerably, although agriculture is representing, proportionally speaking, the largest economic sector in Syria today, around, I think, a bit, I have to check my numbers, but it's a bit more than 30%, 30 to 35%, I think. But because the GDP of the country has been destroyed, diminished from 60 billion to now estimates are around 20 billions. But manufacturing also suffered a lot, while you had service sectors, trade, smuggling exploding. For example, smuggling was existing prior to 2011, but it exploded during the war. And when we see that trade and smuggling expanded massively during the war, it's also one of the aspects to explain the weakening of the manufacturing sector in Syria. And we witnessed, even at some points, criticism from sectors of businessmen involved in the manufacturing sector, criticizing policies of the government of the Syrian regime, favoring traders or favoring trade or smuggling at the expense of the manufacturing sector. Similar dynamics are occurring in the agricultural sector. Just as you have this kind of dynamics when it comes to economy, we can see also that in political terms, the war exacerbated in many ways the patrimonial nature of the regime, this kind of privatization of the regime to the interest of the Assad family, and I would say even the presidential palace, which is even a smaller circle of people than prior to the war. And one of the examples of this is the clash and the rift that occurred between Rami Makhlouf, who was the biggest businessman in Syria and the cousin of Bashar Assad, who was basically cleared of its most important asset, Syria Telecom, the Syrian telecommunication company, and has been suffering attacks by the presidential palace. Another aspect very interesting to see also is the growing importance, not only militarily, of the 4th Brigade of Maher al-Assad, but also in economy. His role, the role of the 4th Brigade in Syria during the war expanded massively, especially in trade and in smuggling. And you also had new business personalities emerging, acting as frontmen for the 4th Brigade. Two main actors in this aspect is Wasim Qattan, a very influential businessman in Syria, who's the head of the Damascus province chambers of commerce, and another kind of smuggler who was dealing also with through Maher al-Assad, and I will come back to this. His name was Abu Ali Tahir, who managed, for example, the smuggling between the areas under the control of the regime and the areas under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham areas in the north of Syria, in Idlib, to bring Turkish products within regime-held areas. So again, to resume my thoughts, I totally agree in the way you frame your various presentations, and Jamie Allison, that I salute, who's a friend. I think is very important to say, especially in the mainstreams kinds of economists presenting a complete separate story from prior 2011, after 2011, as problematic to understand the economic and political dynamics in Syria, while we have also historical experiences, as I was mentioning, in Lebanon, Iraq, and the region, and we can speak also of other countries throughout the world that suffered war. And in this perspective, war is more exacerbating the pre-economic dynamics in a particular country, and in this case, Syria is very clear.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's also really makes sense to include Lebanon in this discussion, because we just recently, unfortunately, through this huge explosion that happened in Lebanon, we were again reminded on the very last aspect you mentioned, that you have post-war political class that evolved through the war, that many dynamics that were that manifested during the war were just strengthened in the post-war economy, and that these very actors then become the ruling political class, and that it becomes really, really hard to get rid of them, and that they then are kind of normalized, because this is what had happened in Lebanon throughout the last years. The ruling political class is then the one also foreign investors talk to, and so on. So I know this also from many Syrian friends, and many activists often take Lebanon as this negative blueprint, as a warning on how they don't want their political and their and the economic dynamics of Syria to evolve once let's not call it the war is over, but once the fighting is over. So I think it's very, very, very important to look to the left and right, and also to realize that this is the dynamic in the region. So thank you for this. Also, when you look at the very, very recent situation in Syria, it's actually quite scary, the picture that is evolving there. So besides the effect Corona has on people, and there are not many reliable numbers actually, but we know from talking to people that especially in regime-held areas in Damascus, it's right now really, really scary in the sense of there is really high numbers of actually people passing away because they have no way to secure themselves from getting infected with the corona virus. But this was just the peak of a lot of other crises that people actually had to encounter. The loss of value of the Syrian lira had huge impact on people's purchasing power. And so the situation now just got actually worse. So from this perspective, it actually appears that the war really disrupted also the economy. But as you, for the civil population, but as you had already mentioned, the perspective of the regime is a little different, because as you had mentioned, it also used it as a chance. And this is why we also used the word reform in the headline to make sure that war is also a chance for these kinds of regimes and for this kind of economic regime. So my question here is threefold. Can you elaborate on the one hand on how the war affected the neoliberal agenda of the regime, and maybe talking a little about the different strategies the regime developed throughout the war, from public-private partnerships and how this had an effect on the already implemented clientelist network. And also in this context, it would be really interesting when you could link this to the question of warlords, another of these terms that is often being thrown around when we discuss the topic of war economy. And it's again a really vague term, and because many Syrians would say, well, the regime before the uprising was already involved in most of the illegal and informal economic activities, so it actually really resembles warlords. So, but nevertheless, let's talk a little about this idea of warlords and their economic activities during the war. So, smuggling activities, especially oil, also the so-called ta'fish. Ta'fish is one of the terms that were invented in the uprising to actually describe the extraction of anything of value of regime soldiers after they entered a reconquered area. So I think that's also a really interesting aspect that these kind of activities had an impact on the language, on how people see and frame the world. I think what would interest us here the most is whether the war situation actually produced a new social class made of these warlords, and what will be their role at the end of the war? Is there a role, or as it's also often viewed at in social science, that it's them that have interest on the continuation of the war? Is this the case in Syria, or do they already form an own class and hence have ways of further extracting resources of the country, even with the end of the war situation? And as we are talking about this probably new social class, it would be interesting to know what is their position towards the old bourgeoisie that was supporting the regime, or as Bassam Haddad had called them in a 2012 article, he has called them the organic backbone of the regime. So we would want to understand the relation also between this old bourgeoisie and the new guard, as you also called them before. And of course, we will post the link to the Bassam Haddad article in the chats. So yeah, I know it's a long question, but here you go, Joseph.
No, thank you, Ansar. It's great questions, and they're completely linked in many ways. First of all, on the issue of chance or opportunity, I think it's a crisis, being wars, financial crisis, even Corona, we're seeing throughout the world are used as a tool to deepen neoliberal policies and austerity measures. Obviously, this depends on the equilibrium of forces within a particular country, if social forces are able to change this particular status or not. But following a war, very often what we see, and especially in the case of Syria, is the weakness of the social and political forces to oppose this kind of neoliberal reforms, called reforms. And on one aspect, what is interesting, and again, I'm going to mention Lebanon, and I really want to put my thoughts with all the Lebanese people now after this new catastrophe that occurred, this criminal tragedy derived directly from the sectarian and neoliberal political system, the explosion, the criminal explosion of Beirut. But one of the main thing that we heard from especially international countries, France, but also the IMF, was that first emergency aid of $250 million euros was given to the Lebanese people, and saying basically we have more billions of dollars that we are ready to send to Lebanon, but this depends on the ability of the next government to implement reforms. What do they mean by reforms? Basically, it's implementing the 2018 CEDAR conference agreement. CEDAR conference agreement was the center for the Conference for the Economic Development and Reform through Enterprise that was sponsored by France. And basically, they didn't call it Paris 5 because there was 4 previous conference, because all were failures, so they changed the name. But basically, is saying that you need austerity measures, fusions of public institutions, cutting salaries, also privatization of the electricity, And if you implement these kind of reforms, there will be $11 billion of loans. So we can see once again, in a couple of days after the tragedy that occurred in Lebanon, already this discourse of so-called wanting to assist Lebanon by these so-called reforms that are basically an opportunity again for the Lebanese ruling class and imperialist countries and foreign businessmen to basically benefit from this crisis. So this is a very clear example again of what we were mentioning about the opportunity used by crisis, wars, etc. And in the case of Syria, this is what is also occurring, but a much more local basis, basically, but also benefiting some foreign countries, and I will explain it. But basically what happened in 2016, the Syrian government, presented a new so-called economic strategy that is called the National Partnership, which basically gives the private sector the main and leading role for the reconstruction and redevelopment, the economic development of Syria. So it's deepening the previous so-called social economic market in which the social was completely forgotten in obviously it's ironic what I'm saying, but was already based on the need of accumulation of private capital, liberalization and privatization of vast sectors of Syria. Today, in this new national partnership strategy, all the sectors of the economy are open to the complete management by the private sector, except oil. So this means any kind of economic sector of Syria can be in private hands, being Syrian or foreign. In this economic strategy, the plan of public-private partnership is the key element to push for this privatization, liberalization of the economy, and it was passed after six years. It was in the first draft was made in 2010, and it was postponed because of the beginning of the war, and was implemented in 2016. Again, the public-private partnership should be understood in a regional dynamic. I was mentioning Lebanon before, but the public-private partnership plan is, for example, a key element in the Saudi Kingdom so-called reform economic strategy, so privatizing huge sectors of the economy, also when it comes to health institutions, when it comes to various institutions of the state. This is a key element in the Saudi Kingdom economic plan, the Saudi, I think it's called 2030 plan, etc. And also what is interesting to see is that it was one of the main objectives to push forward by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 2011 at the beginning of the uprisings in the Middle East. One of the countries that has pushed much further this kind of policies is, for example, Egypt, that has been implementing a lot of PPPs for the past decade. So again, we have to understand, and this is also very, and it's complementary to the first question, is that it's not only that war economy is different, that pre-war economy, it's a continuation, plus it's a regional aspect also. Syrian economy is not separated from the dynamics of the region, even though there's a war, etc. And this is something I think we should put forward as well. So who are the main beneficiaries of today liberalization policies, deepening of neoliberal policies by the Syrian government? Also, this was accompanied, obviously, of new austerity measures, lesser support for particular products, especially necessary products that have become more and more expensive, and this was not only due to the inflation, the diminution of the value of the Syrian pound, that are obviously all elements that have to be taken into account, and also the sanctions, and we'll come back to this later, also the monopoles by particular traders, etc., but also because of the diminishing of supports by the Syrian government for the particular products. Just as the new card, the so-called card that was distributed, that was also a form of PPP. So you had a smart card, that is called a smart card, which is basically a form that is encouraged and promoted by various international monetary institutions throughout the world to diminish basically subventions to particular products. So you are provided by a particular card with which you're allowed to take back, to have certain amount of product. But there's a clear diminution of the products you're allowed through this smart card. And this smart card was given, the production of this card was given to a private company that was partially held by a family member, a close person of Asma al-Assad in Syria. And it brought lots of criticism in Syria, the smart card system, by not working well, diminishing the amount of products that you were allowed, and not equal amount of products according to the areas you were living in. So neoliberal policies and austerity measures going hand in hand. Who were the beneficial of the PPPs? The privatization of sectors of the economy. The most important is definitely the Russian company, Strongas, that has been able to own partially the phosphate company, the production phosphate mine in Knefis. Also has been able to take control of the general fertilizer company in Rif Homs, and to take the management also of the port of Tartus. All of them were made through PPPs or privatization of these kind of companies in the hand now of Strongas company. So now they basically, this company controls the production of phosphate, its process, and its distribution as well through the port of Tartus. But you had also cases of PPPs, for example, privatization of particular sectors benefiting to businessmen close to the regime, obviously. And one of the latest example was Qatirji, who's a businessman that expanded and will come back. This is typically the new kind of businessman that emerged during the war, and again, playing the role as an intermediary. And I'll come back to this later. But he was given by the Syrian government and the Syrian regime the possibility to establish a refinery in Banyas, and the exploration of oil. So, similarly, and I forgot before, 2 other Russian companies were given the possibility to explore and to particular oil sector, oil reserve in certain areas. So we can see basically benefiting foreign companies linked obviously to Russia, an ally of the Syrian regime, but also to particular business actors that are obviously also linked to the Syrian regime. And this is what I was mentioning before. You have a strengthening of this patrimonial aspect of the regime, and also its dependence on foreign actors, especially Russia and Iran. And until today, Russia has been the most important actor to benefit from this privatization. Iran, a lot less. An element also to understand is that this does not come without any kind of it doesn't come with complete acceptance from the Syrian population. Even sectors of what we call, even though I'm not a fan of the term, loyalists, so population are more supporters of the regime, etc. For example, the Ministry of Transport, following the privatization of the Tartus port, had to come on television a couple of times to explain that the port was not given to Russia, or it was not in the hands of Russia, but it was basically a way to expand the port, that it was a 49 years management contract with a particular Russian company, and that the right of the workers of the Tartus port would not be challenged, would not be changed, etc. Which was wrong. Basically, you had a couple of protests by the Tartus port workers, forms of protests for since the Russian company took control of the company, since the Russian company took control of the Tartus port management, workers not going to work or protesting, even going sometimes on strike. And you had a similar forms of protest in the general fertilizer company, because basically when you are under a PPP contract, you are not anymore a public state employee. So you are under the labor law that are for the private sector, which is less advantageous than the public sector employee, where you have more advantage given by the state when it comes to social securities, etc. So these different aspects must be mentioned when we speak about also PPPs, so that it comes also with forms of protest, and obviously lowering the rights of workers that are already very low in Syria and not respected and completely violated, and they don't have nearly any kind of laws to protect them without any kind. And even the General Federation of Trade Union is basically a tool in the hand of the regime, and we'll come back to this, to implement and to discipline the workers in Syria among the public state employees especially. When it comes to what is this, and this also obviously has, in this kind of context, you had the emergence of new businessmen. And as I was mentioning before, the particularity is that they are mostly traders, intermediaries, or frontmen. And they played also a humongous role in smuggling, very often linked with the trade. So legal and illegal trade, basically. And there's a couple of personalities I was mentioning before, Khada Ali Tahir, Qatarji as well. Basically, his role of Qatarji was trading, first of all, with Daesh, in between Daesh and the regime in 2014, between the areas controlled by the regime and the northeast. In the areas controlled by Daesh, it was dealing and marketing agricultural products, but oil as well. And after, he continued his business with the SDF, basically playing an intermediary between the regime and the Syrian Democratic Forces when it comes to the marketing of oil. But the most important new businessman that raised was Samer Foz. Samer Foz was a small businessman prior to the war, and also he played a humongous role during the war as an intermediary, whether from bringing particular products to Syria through Russian companies and making contracts with these kind of Russian companies, or by smuggling a particular amount of also oil through his offshore company into in different countries, or companies, trade companies in Lebanon or in Dubai. So they have this particular aspect of it, and this again is not a break with prior 2011. This was what occurred especially in the period 2000-2011. We had an expansion of the trade sector, even though it started partially in the 80s, but it's really expanded following the arrival of Bashar al-Assad and the deepening neoliberal policies. And after the war, similarly, traders, intermediaries, and frontmen played a more and more important role. And when I speak of frontmen, it's typically the personality I was talking about before, Wassim Qattan, who played basically the role of a frontman for Maher al-Assad. All the personalities that consolidated the business and had been on the Syrian scene for a while is, for example, Mohammed Hamsho, who's been also a very close associate of Maher al-Assad through his family relationship with him. And he expanded and consolidated his power. Samer Foz also was able to take control of various assets of businessmen that left the country after 2011, obviously for the interest of the regime. So when we speak about the old bourgeoisie, let's be also, first of all, careful. And very often in Syria, when we use the term old bourgeoisie, what we mean by the old bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie that led basically the country to the independence and was dominating the countries between the 40s and the 60s until the arrival of the Ba'ath Party. For the large majority of them, they left, or especially because they were also in trade and intermediaries, or with links with also kind of not foreign countries, I would say, but completely linked with also the international, the regional market. This old bourgeoisie was obviously, with the arrival of the Baas in the 63, its role and its presence diminished for a lot of them. They left the country, some went to Lebanon, but also to other countries in Europe or the US. And after you had the building of a new bourgeoisie, basically linked to the regime in the 70s and 80s, following the arrival of Hafez al-Assad and the beginning of the starting of a new liberalization period, even though it was very slow and not the same rapidness and deepness than Bashar al-Assad, but you have a new bourgeoisie that is being built and completely linked to the bureaucracy of the state, of the state bourgeoisie, what we called. And in the 2000s, basically, you have this deepening of the even more of the neoliberal economies, but with the new businessmen that are growing, that are coming to are completely linked to the presidential palace. And the most important example of this was Rami Makhlouf or Hamsho, direct relationship with the presidential palace. So the people that was completely linked to the presidential palace had different destinies. The most famous one is now Rami Makhlouf, and I mentioned him, is a particular, because it's not only about economy, but it's also challenging its power influence, political influence that was growing in particular areas of Syria, especially in the coastal areas, and partially a bit less in Damascus. So it was not only an economic rift, but it's also a political rift to consolidate and concentrate even more all the powers within the presidential palace. And this is also linked to the growth and the expansion of the role of especially Maher al-Assad in economy through the fourth brigade, much more important than 2011. Also partially Asma al-Assad, but less than Maher al-Assad. Mohammed Hamsho consolidated its power. But for example, you have the Jaber brothers in Latakia that grew also expandedly during the war, but because they challenged the regime at some point, their assets were confiscated by the state. And you have a whole series of, I would say, businessmen, sectors of bourgeoisie that left the country. They left the country because basically, especially manufacturers, they left for Egypt, a huge chunk of them, and they are not necessarily anti-regime. You have pro and anti-regime. One of the most famous manufacturers that left Syria was Mohammed Sharabati, from Aleppo, that built the biggest in 2018, the biggest cotton company, I think, in the whole Africa, in Egypt. You have huge chunk that left, basically. And the circle of very important businessmen is now very much smaller, and the accumulation of capital is completely linked to their relationship to the regime, much more than prior to 2011. And again, to come back to your first, and I will finish for this on this question, it shows you that there's no separation, there's a deepening between pre-2011 and after 2011.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this really deep explanation. I think what we can also quite clearly see is that it's really important to take into consideration this economic lenses, because it really disenchants many of the political analysis, especially those that really concentrate on ideological lines. And in order to also show that this discussion is not simply a theoretical one, but that these economic implications have deep materialistic implications on people's realities on the ground, we want to show you a video intervention of Abdallah Al-Khatib. He's a former student of sociology and couldn't continue due to him being wanted by the Syrian regime, and as many others, he then decided to go into an area that was no longer controlled by the Syrian regime. So he set up with many other people a lot of the very important civil society structures in southern Damascus. and was then besieged there by the Syrian regime and its Palestinian allies. So we thought it's really important to have also his voice in this event, again, to make really clear that all of this discussion really has an influence on the materialistic conditions people find themselves in.
أنا عبد الله الخطيب، ناشط فلسطيني سوري من مخيم اليرموك. طلعت السنة الماضية من سوريا وحاليا موجود بألمانيا. بعنواننا اليوم اللي هو الاقتصاد بسوريا بزمن الحرب، حاب أركز على موضوع الحصار كأحد أدوات الاستثمار اللي استخدمها النظام السوري ليحقق مكاسب اقتصادية بسوريا. طبعا الحصار بالتعريف هو إغلاق منطقة جغرافية بالسكان الموجودين فيها بشكل كامل، منع دخول وخروج الأفراد، منع دخول وخروج المواد من داخل المنطقة. غالبا منع دخول بيكون المواد التموينية أو المواد الطبية والمواد اللوجستية. وهو ما له أسلوب جديد، يعني هو أسلوب قديم جديد، يعني تم استخدامه كثير بالحروب، ولكن بسوريا كان سمة الحرب السورية بالإضافة طبعا للبراميل والكيماوي، كان الحصار سمة من سمات الحرب السورية. أكثر من 500 منطقة حوصرت داخل سوريا بفترات زمنية مختلفة. أكثر من 1,000,000 شخص تأثر بشكل مباشر من الحصار. بمخيم اليرموك على سبيل المثال 200 شخص استشهد بفترة حصار مخيم اليرموك ب 2013. الحصار اللي كان عم بنفذه النظام السوري كان عم بيستخدم أدوات عسكرية مختلفة. بمناطق الجيش السوري كان عم بيمارس الحصار، مناطق ثانية ميليشيات عسكرية، ميليشيات طائفية أو ميليشيات فلسطينية متحالفة في اليرموك. بمناطق ثالثة كانت الأفرع الأمنية هي اللي عم بتحاصر المناطق. الهدف الأساسي من كل سياسة الحصار بالنسبة للنظام السوري طبعا هو هدف عسكري له علاقة بأول شيء حرمان المناطق المحررة من التواصل فيما بينها. 2 إرغام المعارضة عبر الضغط على المدنيين اللي كانوا موجودين داخل المناطق من خلال منع الأكل والشرب والدواء عنهم ليستسلموا ويخرجوا من المناطق، وهذا اللي صار بأغلب المناطق، يعني مثل القوطة، مثل جنوب دمشق، ومثل درية ومناطق ثانية. إذا اليوم بدنا نحكي طيب كيف النظام السوري كان عم بيستفيد من على المستوى الاقتصادي من حصار المناطق، فأنا حقيقة حابب أركز على نقطة كتير مهمة من خلال تجربتنا زي ما حكيت بمخيم اليرموك. كل المناطق المحاصرة كان فيها قوة مدنية وعسكرية ناشطة بهاي المناطق، وكل هاي القوة كانت بحاجة أو كانت دائما في عندها نقد أجنبي عم بيتدفق لها عبر شراكات معينة، سواء كان القوى العسكرية وشراكاتها مع دول أو المجموعات المدنية وشراكاتها مع مؤسسات NGOs أو غير NGOs موجودة خارج سوريا. هذا النقد الأجنبي اللي كان عم بيتدفق على المناطق المحاصرة بالنسبة للنظام كثير مهم، لأنه بفترة الحرب طبعا كلنا بنعرف بيصير في شح بتوفر النقد الأجنبي، فكان هذا مصدر جيد بالنسبة للنظام، فحاول يستثمره بشكل كثير كبير. فكان هاي النقطة الثانية إنه نفس النقد اللي كان عم بيجي على المناطق، يعني مثلا الدولار واليورو، كانت تضطر المجموعات تدفع ما يقارب 10% من قيمة المبلغ للسمسار لحتى المبلغ يفوت. طبعا السمسار هو مرتبط بأفرع أمنية أو مرتبط بجهات ما يعني تابعة للنظام السوري، فكان لازم نخسر 10%، وكنا بعدين داخل المنطقة المحاصرة مضطرين نصرف المبلغ بسعر أقل من قيمته الحقيقية. يعني إذا كان الدولار مثلا بدمشق ب 200 ليرة، بمخيم اليرموك كان ب 120 ليرة أو 140 ليرة حسب يعني حسب شدة الحصار. فهذا كله كمان عم بيستفيد منه النظام. النقطة الثالثة هو موضوع تجارة المعابر، صح التعبير، وهي حقيقة نوعين. في تجارة كانت عم بيشتغلها النظام بشكل رسمي وعلني، وكانت يعني بتتم بشكل انه بتفوت مواد تموينية على المنطقة مقابل دفع ضريبة تصل 30% من قيمة المنتج، وهذا الحكي كمان كان مرتبط بتسوية سياسية ما، يعني مو كل المناطق كان عم بيصير فيها هذا الكلام، ولكن المناطق اللي كان فيها تسوية سياسية او ما يسميه النظام السوري المصالحة، كان هيك كان السيستم العام. بمناطق مثل اليرموك مثلا بلحظات معينة مثلا تجار المعابر كانوا عم بيحاولوا يمرقوا بعض المواد التموينية ولكن بأسعار فلكية. يعني على سبيل المثال كيلو الرز بالوقت اللي كان داخل دمشق بدولار كان داخل مخيم اليرموك من 100 ل 120 دولار. موضوع الدخان على سبيل المثال من أكثر التجارات المربحة اللي استخدمها النظام السوري، وصل سعر باكيت الدخان داخل المناطق المحاصرة ل 500 دولار. السعر الحقيقي كان يعني داخل دمشق دولار، أو $2 داخل المخيم وصل سعره ل $500، وأغلب الناس يعني بتدخن، فهذا كمان كان مصدر اقتصادي كتير كبير للنظام. طبعا ما راح احكي باشياء ثانيه لها علاقه بالحشيش والمخدرات وهالاشياء اللي كانوا عم يديروها من الاشياء الطائفيه بين قوسين حزب الله، لانه مش وقته، ولكن كانت عم تتم ايضا هاي العمليات كلياتها. كل هذا الحديث، يعني كل هذا اللي عمله النظام السوري، ما كنا بالمقابل نحن عندنا ردة فعل سلبية تجاه اللي عم بيصير، بالعكس تماما. نحن حاولنا نخلق بدائل اقتصادية تواجه خلينا نقول القوة الغاشمة للنظام السوري بالمناطق. على سبيل المثال، بالوقت اللي النظام السوري منع دخول موارد تموينية للمنطقة، بلشنا نفكر مثلا بالمشاريع الزراعية وكيف فينا نحن نوفر مواد تموينية للناس بالحد الأدنى. ما بدعي انه مشاريعنا الزراعية انقذت مخيم اليرموك او انه هي وقفت موت الناس داخل المخيم، ولكن هي بديل، يعني بديل حاولنا نخلقه وساعدنا حقيقة. يعني إذا أنا بدي أشرح كمان مثال عملي، نحن نفذنا مشروع زراعي داخل مخيم اليرموك بال 2014، تكلفة المشروع كانت 10,000 يورو. هذا المبلغ نفسه لو إنه نحن بدنا نشتري فيه رز ونوزعه للناس، كان اشترينا يعني 10,000 تقريبا 100 حصة غذائية، 100 كيلو رز، هذا بكفي العائلة ليوم واحد. ولكن المشروع الزراعي اللي نفذناه على الأقل وفرنا مواد للناس من 2500 ل 3000 عائلة لمرة واحدة، ولكن بحسبة بسيطة ببين معنا الفرق. فأولا كان في عدد مستفيدين أكبر بكثير من هذا المشاريع، ثانيا كان النظام السوري عم بيستفيد أقل، لأنه نحن لو اشترينا رز بالأخير هاي الفائدة المالية المضافة اللي عم يستفيد منها النظام السوري. كرمال هيك النظام كان عم بيحاول دائما يستهدف هاي البديل الاقتصادي من خلال حرق المحاصيل الزراعية، قصف المحاصيل، قنصة، يعني استخدام أي وسيلة متاحة بين إيديه لمنع الناس من الاستفادة من هاي المشاريع. مشاريع ثانية على مستوى البديل الاقتصادي، على مستوى توفير المواد المحروقات مثلا مثل البنزين والمازوت، تم داخل المنطقة صناعة، يعني إنشاء معامل بنسميها يعني معامل صناعة المازوت الصناعي بين قوسين، اللي هي الفكرة الأساسية هي حرق البلاستيك واستخراج مادة المازوت والزيت للمولدات والمحركات والبنزين الصناعي، لأنه كانت هاي المواد يعني مواد كثير مهمة بالنسبة لنا لتشغيل المولدات الكهربائية والمولدات الصناعية بظل انقطاع تام الكهرباء من قبل النظام. على المستوى الطبي كمان كان في بدائل من خلال مثلا معامل لتصنيع الشاش، القطن، معقمات، احيانا تصنيع سيرومات، يعني سيروم سكري او ملحي، كلياتها كان عم يتم داخل المناطق المحاصره. بمنطقه مثل الغوطه الشرقيه مثلا صاروا يصنعوا غاز من النفايات البيو الموجوده داخل الغوطه. فهي كل البدائل الاقتصاديه حقيقه مو بس كان يعني عم بتساعد الناس تصمد بوجه الحصار، وكمان كانت عم تساعدنا نحن كعاملين بهذا المجال لحتى نخفف من العبء النفسي والضغط النفسي اللي بولده الحصار علينا بفترة وجودنا داخل هاي المناطق بشكل عام. اليوم إذا أنا بقيم تجربتنا حقيقة بمخيم اليرموك وبقيم تجربة الشركاء والأصدقاء اللي كانوا محاصرين بمناطق أخرى، بقول إنه نحن كان في عندنا إمكانية حقيقة إنه نخلق بدائل اقتصادية ناجحة وتوقف بوجه النظام السوري لولا استخدام القوة المفرط من قبل النظام باتجاهنا، وهذا كمان كان عامل إضافي ما فينا يعني نغفله. يعني يعني اليوم بحس انه نحن كنشطاء وكمجموعات مدنيه عم بتطالب اليوم بالحريه داخل سوريا او خارج سوريا، انه نمتلك القدره الكافيه لخلق سياده غذائيه، خلق سياده اقتصاديه خاصه فينا، بعيدا يعني ما نكون دائما نحن مستهلكين، ما نكون نحن دائما باطار الاخر بفرق الاخرين، نحن نكون محرك اساسي لحاجاتنا الاساسيه بعيدا عن القوى الاخرى.
So big thank you for Abdallah for recording his input, and also for those that are further interested in the political economy of the siege. Abdallah has written an article with another activist that also lived in the siege, and we will also share the link in the chat. And just would you like other thoughts you have on the input? Is there something you'd like to comment on the video?
I'll just add that it's very interesting, and I think he brings a lot of points. And again, something that I maybe forgot to talk or to mention before is that indeed checkpoints were a main tool to accumulate capital, and there was even a particular, there were even, you know, competition between particular militias to be at one point, for example, of entry over, for example, while imposing a siege on a particular city or region, or for example, in Damascus, one particular checkpoint was, for example, called the $1 million checkpoint, because they were able to basically accumulate huge sums of capital for any kind of people passing through this checkpoint. And there was actually, at the end of 2018, 2019, this was already posing a problem to businessmen for the transport of merchandise between particular regions. So you had protests in Aleppo as well, encouraged by particular businessmen sending their workers basically in the street against these checkpoints controlled by these militias that were exploiting these workers to accumulate more capital and blocking particular products to be transported to other areas. So it became a point of contention, and you had also kind of this kind of protests between Damascus and other areas. So we can see that it had a particular dynamics, and it was a way for what we're talking. We did not enter much into the deep, but what we call the new warlords, basically these militias, heads of militias, etc., basically accumulated their capital through looting, buying, or can we call it buying real estate at very low prices by pushing their owners to sell at very low prices, basically accumulating private capital in from looting from particular economy, particular sectors they were involved into it, to invest it into real estate, to particular restaurants, etc. And we've seen in the latest, actually, parliamentary so-called elections in Syria, a lot of these so-called, new businessmen or warlords were elected in parliament. A lot of people linked to militias were elected, or directly or indirectly were elected in parliament as a way to reward their loyalty to the regime. And it's a way also for them to reach the to control and mobilize this popular basis in favor of the regime at different points. And the last point I would make that made Abdallah, that I think is very important, and again, not only limited to Syria, it's about the issue of food sovereignty. Economic sovereignty obviously should be not a single country. I think I understand his point, but it's also about being linked to other countries, but on a basically in a social aspect of it. The problem basically is not having a connected economy, because this is an absolute necessity, but not being into dynamics of profits and capital, and that destroys economy basically, and enable particular imperialist countries to control the economies of others. But definitely food sovereignty is a question that we're asking today. And again, to make the links from the previous questions, we should not forget that the crisis of agriculture in Syria started prior to 2011, when you have the deepening of neoliberal policies. Actually, in the beginning of the 2000s, you had this discussion of the counter reforms compared to the 60s, where you had, and the end of the 50s, where you have distribution of lands to the peasants and the people that work on it, while at the beginning of the 2000s there was a process of privatization of these lands and giving it to the big landowners. And actually you had this famous in a newspaper by an opposition member that now Ali Ferzat, who said, after 50 years of he entitled this article, after 50 years of the Baas, the feudals are back, basically. And also the amount of people working in agriculture diminished from 1.4 million to 800,000. And this was prior to the ecological problems that occurred in the Northeast, etc. So, and today Syria has to import basically a lot of agricultural products. Now I forgot the term in English. Help me answer. قمح. I can't hear you.
Wheat?
Wheat, exactly, to Syria from Russia. Well, it was self-sufficient before 2011, and they were even partially exporting it. So today it is a very important also question, and it increased the dependence of Syria on Iran. And again, I think it's a question. And food sovereignty is a key question today. And how do we encourage, this possibility of people basically helping them to stay in rural areas, and enabling them to produce and also food that is not polluted by the various products and by the big companies that basically push out the peasants and the workers from agricultural lands for these kind of big companies and intensive agricultural products that are completely catastrophic, whether economically, ecologically, and in terms of demographic, pushing people out from rural areas and pushing them into very often poor neighborhoods in big cities. This is a process that we witnessed as well in Syria. So all the points, I think, and showing this particular example of Yarmouk is very interesting.
Thank you for this comment. I think what's also really important, you already mentioned it, the aspect of food sovereignty, but also that people have this vision. So people in Syria produce this kind of visions for how they want the future to be, and it's still there. And I think it's really important, especially for leftist forces, for progressive people who want to be in solidarity with people in Syria, to take these voices serious. And I would now want to come to the aspect on how internationally is reacted on an economic, political level to the situation in Syria. It seems that Western states mainly try to counter the violence in Syria by implementing sanctions. There are the sanctions of the EU that mainly, as they frame it, target those responsible for the suffering, so members of the regime, their supporters and business people who finance the regime and benefit from the war economy. But since mid-June this year, the US also reaffirmed its sanctions regime on Syria by the so-called CISA, Syrian Civil Protection Act, actually a kind of euphemistic term. And colloquially, it's often referred to simply as the CISA law. And it would be now really interesting for us to hear what you think, what's the rationale behind these sanctions. We actually see, we already mentioned it, that the economic situation of, the living situation of people in Syria is really, really bad, and the sanctions of the US are really, really overwhelming and really broad. So in this aspect, they also differ a little from the EU sanctions and appear to be less targeted. And so what do you see as the rationale behind these sanctions, and do you think it can be realized? And what are the actual effects we have to reckon on the civil population in the different areas of Syria? And probably also, what would you see as alternative to sanctions regimes?
Yes, the issue of sanctions is very often a heated debate among Syrian Democrats and people that support the Syrian uprising, and rightly so. I think it's a complicated. Also, first of all, we should acknowledge the complication of this subject, but I will try to to tackle the various angles that I think are very important in my mind. So first of all, obviously the US official line is saying that if Syria respects certain numbers of demands, we will stop the Caesar Act. And for example, you do have the end of bombing of Idlib, the end of bombing of hospitals, particular health institutions, the liberation of political prisoners, the accountability for the war crimes. And there's other aspects that if the Syrian regime respected that, they will withdraw their sanctions. Obviously, no one can object to this kind of achievement if they would be made. If they would be made, no one could oppose the end of the bombing of Idlib, the liberation of political prisoners, etc. At the same time, the US official line should not be taken for what it is, basically what they're seeking, and they have explicitly themselves, US officials say that their objective is not to change the regime in Syria, but to change basically its behavior, especially regarding foreign policy and its relation to Iran and Hezbollah. If the Syrian regime would change its particular behavior and relation towards these two actors, and most Iran more particularly, there would be a change of reaction as well from the US. And I'm not saying this out of simple opposition to the US, but if we look at US or other Western states in the region, their record regarding themselves seeking respect of human rights is rather not only bad, is opposed basically to the emancipation of the popular classes in the Middle East, respect of human rights. I mean, the US and Western states have been supporting and are supporting until today various authoritarian regimes, despotic regimes, been selling arms to them, granting them legitimacy and protection. So we must be very clear when it comes to US objectives and not only follow the official line. At the same time, when it comes to the effects of the sanction, and again, the sanction prevent, a reconstruction model based on, exposing basically popular classes of particular neighborhoods and replacing them by wealthy people and inhabitants that would be much closer to the regime. And the best example of this is basically the luxurious real estate scheme in Damascus, and close to Damascus, that is called, I now forgot the name. I'm very bad in names. Help me answer. Maruta city. Yeah, sorry, I'm losing the names. So Maruta city is a very good example of that. And no one again can oppose this, just as Russia and Iran get basically winning the spoils of war by taking sides of the economy of Syria. This said, when it comes to the effects of the sanctions, first of all, one can oppose, and I will explain why I oppose the Caesar sanction, because the Caesar sanction basically also target any kind of people working from far or not over a particular company with the Syrian regime, and also any kind of company helping Iran and Russia. But the sectors targeted are very wide. There's 6 or 7 in addition to reconstruction. You have engineering, aviation, engineering, energy, etc. So it is very, very wide. To give you an example, for example, Lebanon, the Lebanese government cannot buy any more electricity from the Syrian regime. One of the aspects of this, and I'll speak about the effect, but what is important to say is that we shouldn't fall also in the regime's discourse saying basically the economy is bad, the people are suffering because of the sanction. The first responsible for the situation in Syria today, the devastating, the destruction of the economy, is the Syrian regime and its allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah and others, when it comes to their war policies of destroying vast areas of cities, neighborhoods, region, etc., but also because of what we mentioned before, the effects of the neoliberal policies of the Syrian regime. And this should be made very clear without falling into, so we do not fall in the regime's discourse and its supporters that the sanctions are the main reason for the devastation of the economy in Syria. This being said, and I'll acknowledge, no one can deny as well that the sanctions have a participating effect on deepening the problems and affecting the Syrian people, and especially the popular classes of Syria. To say exactly how much percentage it does is very complicated because we have different aspects of it. And I mentioned it before. Sanction on its own should be linked with the monopole of particular traders, with the austerity measures of the regime, etc. So it's very hard to say in terms of percentage how much is affecting the Syrian economy. But it is, and to give you an example, for example, Syria is lacking gas and oil for local consumption. If you have a private company that have a contract with the Syrian government to rebuild, for example, a gas station or a gas center, or to increase the production of gas or oil, it will fall under the sanction. And this has direct consequences on the Syrian popular classes and also in the productive sectors of the economy, manufacture and agriculture, that need these particular products, for example, for their own daily activities. And I could show other examples when it comes, obviously, to the drugs or dual-use products, the problem when it comes to the sanctions. So people will tell you, yes, there are humanity exemptions to these kinds of problems. The problem is that this is very theoretical. The humanitarian exemptions, it is automatic for the United Nations agencies, and this we can talk also a lot of the problem with the United Nations agencies when it comes to distribution of products to particular areas, and very much influenced by the regime and controlled by the regime and how it is used. But when it comes to INGOs or NGOs working in Syria or working on Syria in neighboring countries or even in Europe, these sections have serious effects on their capacities to help the Syrian people, whether in Syria or in neighboring countries. When it comes to financial transactions, Syria is completely a red flag and you have a lot of transactions that are blocked, but also to bring particular products in terms of, you have, for example, I had an example also for businessmen that are not necessarily all pro-regime, but he wanted to bring a particular machine or tool to Syria. The company in Germany would not sell this particular product because it was scared to fall under the sanctions, and afraid of the sanctions. So humanitarian exemption when it comes even to particular product that could be, for example, dual use, lots of people will not want to work with Syria because of being afraid to fall under the Syrian sanctions, basically. And I talked about the financial sector as well. And so you have a lot of different products that won't reach Syria, even though they could be reached through humanitarian exemption because of this, basically what we call a bit of the invisible size of the sanctions. And it's not enough. And also it's a long process to reach the humanitarian exemptions. And for each country, you have different rules to follow in terms of sanctions, etc. And there are historical examples that sanctions targeting wide sectors of the economy do not target directly the biggest businessman that always use the smuggling market, basically, or the smuggling dynamics. And this will increase, actually, and this is, again, a continuation of what we were saying prior to 2011, of the informal economy, basically, and the smuggling dynamics, etc., and helping the traders, etc., through this. They are able to bypass the regime of sanctions, but smaller, for example, shopmen, the particular ordinary Syrians, are not able to bypass this sanction. And this reinforces also, therefore, the patrimonial aspects of the regime and its ability to distribute these particular products to the populations. And again, using historical examples, not a single regime has fallen who changed radically its policies because of sanctions. Iraq is one point in case, prior to 2003, and we've seen the consequences. Obviously, it's not the same level of sanctions. Iraq was far worse in all aspects. But with the Caesar sanction, there's a threat that, to some aspects, Syria would fall into this category. But Iraq fell not because of the sanction, but because of the military intervention. Iran did not change its policies, and we've seen also the Iranian regime using the sanction to explain that the economic problems in the countries are solely because of the sanction. And obviously this does not work, but it is completely because we've seen continuous labor protests and important social protests in Iran, but it also partially true, but also not the whole side of the story. While at the same time you had the Pasdaran, that is not only, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is a main institution in Iran, and became a second state, not only militarily, but in economy as well, benefiting from also bypassing the sanction because they have the means, they have the capacities to do this. So throughout the world, there's no kind of historical example to show that a regime has changed radically its policies or has been overthrown because of the sanction. One example is very often used by particular supporters of wide sanction is the South African case prior to the apartheid regime. Basically, this example is not really good in many aspects because Western countries that impose sanctions very late, first of all, we should remind everyone, in the end of the 80s, and were partially not respected. For example, in the case of Switzerland, you had companies providing still particular products and dealing with the South African apartheid regime despite the sanctions, but it was a pressure from below that made the apartheid regime, and it was the popular resistance from below, from the South Africans and the African National Congress, etc. So this is important to say. So it's not the discussion is not saying no sanction. I'm in favor of sanctions regarding individuals that committed crimes, and I think accountability is a humongous step important to take for any kind of anyone who's interested in democracy and in seeking justice. And I think what is happening in Germany right now regarding the the pursuance of a war criminal is very important. But wide sanctions have negative effect on the people while will not push or Syria or Russia or Iran to change radically their position.
As you already mentioned the popular classes in Syria, but you also gave the example from Iran, where you really have widespread strikes and demonstrations in the fabrics and in factories. Can you elaborate a little on this when it comes to Syria? Because in Syria, at the very beginning of the uprising, there were these attempts of actually organizing a general strike. It, in the end, never happened. There was really low participation, and mainly from shop owners. But nevertheless, it's a really important example also from the history of the uprising that is also often not present in leftist discussions on Syria and the uprising. So it's always good to remember this strike of dignity, as it was called. But how is it today with the labor dissent? You recently also just wrote an article about it, and we will also post it. But can you, what are the potentials of this labor dissent you see right now in mainly these Russian-owned factories? How can solidarity look like with on this level with these workers? And especially considering that there is no independent labor movement in Syria since the rise of the Ba'ath Party to power.
Yes, indeed, it's a very important point, I think, and In this manner, there's a couple of points I would like to say. First, that historically speaking, the Baas arrival to power in 1963 was an advancement in terms of interest for the peasants and workers in general. But at the same time, the Baas, even at its most radical period before Hafiz Assad, never accepted any kind of combative trade unionist and always wanted to control these trade unions or peasants associations. So they were repressing the most combative sectors of these trade unions. And in the 70s, what happened is that Hafiz Assad transformed completely these kind of trade unions, or for example, the General Federation of Trade Union that is basically the largest, it's the General Federation of Trade Union for the public sector, and very small, and nearly all public sector employees must be a member of the General Federation of Trade Union, and very small amount among the private sector, nearly none. Basically in the 70s, they decided that they shouldn't have any kind of demands to the state, because the state was pursuing a socialist path, and its main role should be to help the productivity of the regime. And they did not oppose also the various measures taken in the various decades against the workers. And they were controlling the workers, controlling and repressing any kind of dissent among workers. And you had different strikes in the 80s, and they played a very negative role in this manner. So when it comes to the uprising, basically and the professional associations who were very active at the end of the 70s were all disbanded and re-established with only leaderships of the Baas. Until now, all the leadership of the professional association, the General Federation of Trade Union, are Baasist. And when the 2011 occurred, basically what happened is that among the professional association of lawyers, you had a little bit of activities, but in terms of labor activity per se, it was very low as opposition. You didn't, and this was obviously the result of repression, of decades of repression, the role of the General Federation of Trade Union to repress and control workers within it, also the role played by the regime to divide the popular classes and including the workers through tribal, sectarian, ethnic lines, etc. And the thing is that the opposition, the main opposition in exile, never was interested in mobilizing people as workers. At not single moment, and this was prior even 2011. There was debate ongoing in 2005, even by former, what we consider leftists like Michel Kilo, or parties like the Hizb al-Sha'b, the former Communist Party. There was no attempt to try to mobilize workers. And throughout the 2000s, there were no real discussion or program to mobilize workers or to denounce the socioeconomic situation in Syria. It was the main argument was around democracy. And this continued in the uprising. I'm not saying it's wrong to ask for democracy, but we cannot limit the discourse to this. We need to have a socioeconomic appeal. And actually, I think this is why it's very important to take the example of the independent trade unions in Egypt that played an important role at the beginning of the Egyptian uprising, in the strikes, etc. Even though they were repressed massively and had some bad political decisions, for example, some of them supporting the Sisi coup against in July 2013, but they did play a role within the opposition. And more recently, Sudan, or the Gathering Professional Association, were able, and in Tunis with the UGTT, were able to have a situation of nearly dual power, challenging the power of the regime. And this in Syria, unfortunately, was not the case. And I think we should take example of these experiences to build in the future on democratic demands, but also socioeconomic demands to be able to build on this. And today, unfortunately, the various social economic protests that we've witnessed, for example, in Sweden or in Dar'a, the labor dissent that I discussed, are completely separated with no kind of connections and no kind of opposition appealing to these people that are protesting not only for democratic issues, but also for socio-economic. This was very clear in Sweden. And the people that demonstrated were very young, or university students, or people that just graduated. So they were young kids when the uprising started. And this is important to say that it's new people. and we should seek the contradictions of the regime among whether considered supporters of the regime or opponents, and seeing the common interest. And this, through this, there's an ability to challenge also, it's not automatic as well, but with common experiences, various issues of, you know, sectarianism, racism, etc. So there's a long way to go, but I think there are experiences that we can build on, especially regarding Egypt, Sudan, and Tunis. And when you see the situation of Tunis and Sudan, it's the less worse, and it's basically because they had a strong labor movement, alongside also a strong, organized, and mass feminist movement in both countries. That is important to say, to push forward also feminist demands and women's rights demands that are completely linked to democratic and socio-economic interests. And I think this were one of the problems of the opposition of not dealing or tackling these kind of aspects, and quite on the opposite, actually, promoting also forms of neoliberal policies, and not very different from the Assad regime. And it showed also the background of the political leadership of the opposition, basically.
Sorry.
Thanks a lot. I think you already answered the question whether the Syrian opposition, and hereby I mean the so-called official opposition outside of Syria, whether they have any alternatives or any economic visions for Syria, and you already said this is not the case, although as we have heard, there are it's not organized, but there are visions from Syrians, from Syrian civil society on how they at least do not imagine the Syrian future. So there's the example of the Aleppo project, who focus on a people-led approach of rebuilding Aleppo, and hereby having Beirut in mind, where this was completely out of space to have people participation after the war in the reconstruction of Beirut. And there are other similar projects, but it's not that it's an organized movement, unfortunately. And I would now want to open the discussion to our audience. And again, I encourage you to post more questions. We already have 2 questions. So the first question is from Tanya Scheiterbauer. She sent us a question on Zoom, and she asks on whether you could elaborate a little more on the economic, on the agriculture sector. She would be interested to know how the agricultural sector was affected by the war and how it is developing during the war. So maybe you could first answer this question, Joseph, and I will collect more questions.
Yeah, so in absolute terms, agriculture diminished by 40 to 45% in terms of production and capacities of production during the war. And these were statistics, I think, from 2016, 2017. So it might be even worse now in terms of agricultural production. And actually the heart of the agricultural production in Syria is in the northeast. And you do have currently, and it's been going for the past few years, kind of a war to get various agricultural products between Syrian democratic forces and the regime, and to some also in the northwest between the various opposition forces and the regime, buying at the highest pay particular products to farmers and peasants, and also the way the General Federation of Peasants is playing a role to try to create dissent among areas where, for example, are controlled by other powers than the regime, and trying to seek contact with these farmers or particular presence to bring them back in their networks, etc. So you do have this particular aspect that are also of power competition on the ground directly, especially when it comes to the Syrian democratic forces and the regime to this aspect of the agriculture. And also agriculture has been affected by the way, basically the deepening of, big agricultural landowners, very often sometimes linked to heads of militias, buying or even nearly stealing, because it's buying a very low price, pieces of lands and creating big farms for their own interest and producing on this. And you had other cases simply of stealing lands of people that were absentees and using them not only for obviously agricultural aspects, but to change, putting and then, for example, for small producers of particular produce or small agricultural farms, etc. So you have these different aspects when it comes to agriculture, and obviously they're just as the manufacturing sector being hit also by all the importance and the expansion of the trade sector and of the smuggling sector as well. That is also touching them partially by the importation of particular products from Turkey or from China. And also they've been affected obviously by the economic situation when it comes to the diminution of the Syrian pound. Their purchasing power has diminished considerably, or to reach particular tools to produce, or the important raise of oil and the lack of oil also plays a role when it comes to tractors, etc. Although different machines. So more generally, it is affected as the other sector, like the manufacturing sector, the productive sector. There's a continuation from prior 2011 by deteriorating both sectors and pushing people to leave basically their lands.
Then there is a question from Tristan, who sent it on Facebook, and he's asking whether there are any effects of the trial in Koblenz on Damascus. Quickly, the trial in Koblenz is in Koblenz, the higher regional court is charging Anwar R and Yad A, two former officials of President Bashar al-Assad's security apparatus for crimes against humanity. And so for everyone to have the background, and Tristan is asking whether there are effects of this to be felt in Moscow. Do you have any idea of this, Joseph?
I don't have any clear idea of what the sense is about this trial. I think when it means in Damascus, I don't think the city or the inhabitants, but the power of the regime of Assad. But I think whether this, or more importantly, I think what would affect the regime is, for example, the possibility of trying Omar al-Bashir, the former Sudanese dictator, that will most probably, hopefully, being a judge in like Hague, who was the last who made a visit to Bashar al-Assad a couple of weeks before the beginning of the Sudanese uprising. And this is what I was saying before. It is very important, even though they might not think about it today, that we always seek accountability, even decades after it might occur. Who would have thought that, Omar Bashir now, after 3 decades in power, would be hopefully sitting very soon in a trial to be judged for its crimes. Even though it's not all its crimes, it's partial crimes, but it's a first step forward for seeking accountability and justice for all the families of the prisoners, etc. So I would say that it might have an effect, even small. It is important to support this kind of campaigns, or yeah. Can't hear you.
I would also say there's a really, really important symbolic aspect to it, and it's, you can really feel this in Germany amongst the Syrian diaspora. They protest in front of the courthouse. As you mentioned, there are several campaigns, and we should also historically actually consider that this is the very first trial for former members of a regime that is still in charge. So it's not a former regime. This, the crimes we hear about in the trial, they're still ongoing. And for many Syrians, this is also a kind of recognition of that this is actually happening. Because as you know, Joseph, like throughout the last couple of years, many people, many activists also inside of Syria, we talked to, they ask themselves whether they are at all hurt, like whether people know what's going on, because they felt like there's no recognition, there's no reaction. So at least this trial has, on this level, it really has a symbolical weight. And what I also do know that Syrian civil society inside of Syria does follow what is going on in this trial, and they do have the details. And for people that are further interested in this, we will also in a bit post an article from Dr. Revolution, where you can read up these different voices from oppositionals of the Syrian civil society in Syria. So not from the regime side, let's say. Yeah, but I think it's an important layer. And there's also a question from Ammar. He sent it on Zoom. Thank you for your question. And I'll read his question. He's asking, has the regime provided any kind of economic facilities to change the power centers of the opposition militia?
If I understand well the question, basically the areas retaken by the regime, whether militarily, directly, or through so-called reconciliation agreements, this area have been continuously basically impose forms of punishment that continues. For example, the very important example is Ghouta, the city of Douma that is continuously destroyed, that there's no investment to for buildings. Obviously, it's mostly through private initiatives, but also when it comes to the economy, to try to to redevelop the manufacturing, the small manufacturing sectors that you had existed in the city, or the agriculture sector. On the opposite, the various militias linked to the regime are trying to exploit this situation to push forward, particular real estate scheme, or buying particular real estate in the cities to the absentees, or pushing people to sell, while the administrative and public institutions are not renovated or reparated to provide for large, for still the population living in these areas, even though it's much less than prior to the war. But when it comes, and most of the services are therefore therefore provided or by the Red Cross or by various UN agencies, and not by the state. So there's a form of continuation of punishment. We see the same, for example, also in Eastern Aleppo. Very little level of reconstruction, reparation, mostly private initiatives, while you had other areas of the city that were not destroyed as much, that benefited from particular funds, even though not great, to be renovated or reparated, mostly in areas that were controlled during the whole period by the regime, or particular economic sectors like the Souk, some sectors of the Souk, etc. And there are also, there's a continuation of forms of punishment by people, not only, I'm not talking alongside, obviously, assassinations attempts against former opposition members, whether armed opposition members or soldiers, and civilian continuation of arrest, while in the so-called reconciliation agreement, they had normally form of protections. They've been attacked, etc. But also when it comes to particular areas of Daraa that were under the control of the opposition, still receiving less services from the state, less services by the state than areas that were maintained under the regime areas. And this is not to say that even in regime-held areas, you have a lack of state institutions, provisions of services, etc. But there's a former continuation of punishment in areas that were controlled by former opposition armed groups. And also not reinvesting in the possible economic developments by letting, kind of Red Cross, Syrian Red Cross, or Red Crescent, Syrian Red Crescent, or various INGOs or UN agencies taking care of the poor services still available.
Thank you. And there is also a question that reached us on Facebook. Thank you, Harald Etzbach, for your question. He is asking about whether you could elaborate on the deals between the SDF and the American oil firms. Do you have some insight on this question, Joseph?
Yes, so we'll see. First of all, I want to say hi to my friend Harold, and thank you for attending this event. No, I think this deal is a way also to a bit of hide the possible, basically because the SDF should be under the sanction regarding the Caesar Act because of its dealing of oil with the regime through the personality of Qatarji, who's also under the sanction of the Caesar Act. It's a way a bit to say that to hide this, but I don't believe that it will be a long-term investment because of the lack of certitude and stability for this region that is still under the threat of Turkey and the Syrian regime, and the lack of possibility of any kind of stability when it comes to US foreign policies. Trump changes its opinion every 2 days, 3 days, but also there's an upcoming elections that might also bring changes to US foreign policies. And this is why I'm not particularly sure that this agreement this deal will transform into something on the ground. I'm very much waiting for any kind of serious investments in a region that is under the threat of various actors. So yeah, I'm still in the expectations. I think there's various geopolitical games, but this would mean, in other words, a long-term investment of the US in this area, where, as we remember, they already did a partial withdrawal last year that led to sectors of this area taken by the Syrian regime and Turkey as well. So I'm very much in expectation to see how much this would translate into reality and not only an announcement, basically.
And as we would want to finish around 9 o'clock, we are already discussing for almost 2 hours. I would now take Tristan's question that reached us on Facebook as the last question. And I think, Joseph, it's also one of the topics you would like to talk about. And Tristan is asking about what kind of unions or worker groups are there in Syria. So maybe you can elaborate a little on this.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry to be a bit always long in my answers because no, when it comes to, so obviously in Syria, any kind of trade unions or professional association outside of the realm of the regime is just not possible. So you have as I mentioned, the General Federation of Trade Union that is basically nearly a bit less than 1 million members, most completely nearly in the state institutions, very low amount in the private sector, and you have nearly quasi nil any kind of organization among the private sectors in terms of trade union, or linked to the regime, but it's nearly non-existent. And the rights of workers in the private sectors are, the private labor sector law is catastrophic and doesn't prevent, even though it might provide on paper to particular rights, for example, insurance, health insurance, etc. Most of the private sector do not respect it, and I explained this in the paper and their conditions, and especially when you have a growing informal labor, so you have even less rights to. And as we know, and there's been a couple of books not only regarding Syria, but the difficulties of being able to organize also in the formal sector, even though you do have experiences, for example, in India and other countries, partially in Egypt, but a bit less, of organizing informal labor. So when it comes to workers' groups, it's mostly, as I said, now what exists in Syria is controlled by the regime. I'm talking about regime-held areas. Regarding, you had the foundation of various trade unions, but mostly professional associations in opposition held areas that are still existing, for example, in Idlib today. And at the beginning of the uprising, you had various professional associations, and especially among lawyers, establishing new professional associations. But this was mostly the case among lawyers. Among workers' trade union, it wasn't really existing. Very low, very small numbers, very small groups, but we're not very often able to continue. But for example, lately, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I think it was end of June, beginning of July, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, for example, forbid a gathering of the various professional associations in Idlib, because linked to opposition groups. The problem of these various professional associations is they're mostly concentrated on democratic demands and participating in local institutions. This is mostly when you see the kind of program is participating in better local institutions, etc. But the issue of improving the conditions of workers and the rights of workers is nearly absent, unfortunately. So but this is not to say that you have an heritage also of different leftist group that is a bit still alive, more theoretically, unfortunately, than on the ground. For example, the Labor Communist Party that used to very, very much critical of the various labor codes law in the 80s. They issued papers on this, and I really advise everyone to read the latest book of who was a member of this party, Ratib Shabo, the history of the Labor Communist Party, that just came out in Arabic only, but tells you about these small stories of labor strikes from the 80s, etc., and the criticism. So these kind of personalities are, unfortunately, most of them outside of Syria suffered harsh times in prison or elderly, but there's still an heritage of this kind of leftist. But what is interesting to see is this kind of new socio-economic discontent that we were mentioning before, and Asar asked me about for example, in Sweden and Der'a, and you have also labor dissents I was mentioning in these various companies because of the deepening socio-economic problems and the attacks on labor's rights, and the purchasing power of Syrians have diminished considerably. So when the war is far from finished, but in areas that have now known particularly years of rather, I would say, not political stability, but forms of stability, the contradictions are emerging once more again, and that the socioeconomic aspect is coming to the fore is very interesting. And the new generation of people I was mentioning, Sweden is mostly people that were adolescent or young kids when the revolution started nearly 10 years ago. So there's a necessity to concentrate on these new forms of new people entering basically the protest movement, and especially on socio-economic aspect linked to the democratic aspect. Because when you want to an independent trade union, it's about talking about democratic demands. And this is why I was mentioning Egypt in this perspective that is interesting. The independent trade unions from the main controlled state federation. Well, to conclude, it's even though it's a very harsh situation in the whole region, we always ask ourselves what can be worse after Beirut. Unfortunately, it's always something worse happening, but the roots of these uprisings are more than ever present. And therefore, this gives us a bit of hope, while not undermining the huge, huge, huge challenges and the difficulties to try to organize emphatically in despotic regime and socio-economic crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much for your last sentence. I would have concluded in a similar way, especially as you have just mentioned this new generation, and also with regards to your sentence that Syria cannot be separated from the dynamics happening in the region. So when we look at Iraq, also considering the labor movement, it has in some ways similar history to Syria, and we see after the war how hard it was actually to build up labor movements and not just having different labor organizations there. But nevertheless, we also see there that the young generation is still on the streets, and they are raising demands of workers. So I also, despite everything, I have a lot of hope in these dynamics. So thank you a lot, Joseph, for your energy, especially in these days. And I think it also continuously reminds us on we have to continue this discussion. Like we have to discuss with each other. We have to educate ourselves on these topics. Also know where we can support people in their struggles. So thank you, and thanks a lot to Abdallah also for his input. So if you would be here right now, you would get some chocolate. Now I will eat it myself with Georg. We also want to thanks a lot. He's behind the scenes, you cannot see him, but he did all the technical support today, and of course also conceptualized the series with me. And last but not least, I want to thank Ashak Reisen that offered us their rooms and their technical equipment to host this event today. And again, all of this wouldn't have been possible without the support of the Bildungswerk of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and the Deutsche Klassenlotterie. And this event was recorded, and the recording and also the video of Abdallah, you can find it online on our platform, and we will now post the link to the platform in the chats on Zoom and on Facebook. And there you can watch this video, but also other videos separately from each other. So please spread them. I think these short inputs we also had in the last events are just important to get out there, and you also find them on our YouTube channel. So if you liked this event and you have similar ideas, you share our approach, then please get in touch with us, or even consider to become a supportive member and donate to sustain our work. So thanks also for the audience, for your questions, for the engagement, and I wish you all a good evening, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks.